Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Ulrich, and I am the director of NYU Washington, D.C. I am happy to welcome you to the Abramson Family Auditorium for the third lecture in our Global Leaders series. A special welcome to our students from NYU Abu Dhabi and NYU New York who are studying with us this January, as well as students from the Duke and Georgetown semester in DC programs. Thank you as well to Tom McIntyre and Shruti Ramadugu from our DC staff for helping to organize tonight's event. In this speaker series, leaders from around the world have joined us in conversations that probe critical global issues and explore the policies designed to address them. Tonight's program focuses on the conflict in Syria and implications for the Syrian people and surrounding nations. Our host and moderator, Dr. Lan Ben-Meir, is an expert on Middle East politics and affairs and specializes in peace negotiations between Israel and Arab states. Dr. Ben-Meir serves as senior fellow at New York University Center for Global Affairs. Dr. Ben-Meir writes for a variety of media outlets, including a syndicated column for the Jerusalem Post. He makes regular television and radio appearances and has been featured on a variety of networks, including at NYU Washington, D.C. Dr. Ben-Meir has authored 7 books on Middle East policy and is currently working on a new book about the psychological dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are also thrilled to be joined by our 2 esteemed panelists who survived traffic to get here, Mona Yakubian and Ambassador Frederick Hoff. Mona Yakubian is Senior Advisor to the Stimson Center for Middle East Program and also co-directs the Stimson U.S. Institute of Peace Lebanon Working Group. Her work focuses on the Arab uprisings with a particular concentration on Syria. She is the Director of Pathways to Progress, Peace, Prosperity, and Change in the Middle East, a joint initiative with the George C. Marshall Foundation, to study Arab revolts and seek innovative policy solutions that promote peace and prosperity. Previously, she has worked with the U.S. Institute of Peace, the U.S. State Department, and she is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Hoff is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. In March of 2012, President Obama conferred on him the rank of ambassador in connection with his new duties as Special Advisor for Transition in Syria. Ambassador Hoff was previously the Special Coordinator for Regional Affairs in the U.S. Department of State Office of Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, where he advised Special Envoy George Mitchell. He focused on the Syria-Israel and Israel-Lebanon matters, as well as the full range of Arab-Israeli peace issues falling under his purview. Following tonight's discussion, there will be a short reception in the B1 lobby, and please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I want to also thank the staff here that put this together, especially Shruti, as well as, of course, Tom. Thank you both. We have decided today to discuss something rather simple. That is the Syrian civil war, the crisis, the tragedy that the Syrian people have been experiencing for the last 3 years. Some numbers being thrown around, how many Syrians have died, from 100 to 120, and I can tell you almost for sure that the numbers exceeded probably 150, perhaps more. Nearly one third of the Syrian people are either refugees or being displaced, and about maybe a similar percentage of the country is laying in ruin. This is, I was talking later this afternoon with a friend of mine, and we both agreed, and I'm sure my friends here agreed too. I think this is the greatest tragedy that has inflicted on the Syrian people, and certainly the greatest that have come to the region that I remember, at least for 100 years now. I don't recall that the Middle East have experienced such a tragedy of this magnitude. And there's so many ironies about this horrifying conflict. I was mentioning to a friend of mine earlier that more than nearly 15,000 children have died. And if they were to stand up and hold hands, just think of this, they will form a 20 miles long line. So without further ado, just for this gloomy introduction, I am delighted, more than delighted, to have these 2 incredibly knowledgeable on this particular subject. And so I'm going to start with you, Mona. I know we're talking about the upcoming Geneva 2. I don't want to make any personal observation at this point, but where do you think we're going to go with this conference, if it's going to be held, and who's going to be there?
Well, those are great questions, and good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation. The first question as to whether or not it's going to happen, I think is still a valid question to ask. The Syrian opposition is still deciding, the Syrian opposition coalition is still deciding whether or not to attend. But I guess my sense is, even if it goes off on the 22nd, as it's currently conceived, it's very hard for me to see how it's going to move the ball forward, given the situation on the ground. Which is to say, will those who represent the Syrian opposition at the table have much sway or influence on the ground? And even if they were to come to some kind of agreement, let's say they were to negotiate a ceasefire, would those Syrian opposition representatives at the table have the influence on the ground to, in fact, implement that?
That's right.
So my sense is, unfortunately, I think it's premature at this time to bring the Syrian protagonists to the table.
So now, having said that, Fred, suppose someone the President of the United States or Secretary of State said, Fred, is there anything we can do to improve the prospect of getting something out of this conference in Geneva within 2 weeks? What's your take on that?
Yeah, first of all, Alon, thank you for the invitation, and thank all of you for sacrificing a significant part of your Wednesday evening. But I think, between Mona and I, we'll try to be entertaining enough to make it worth your while. I was, as a government official in 2012, I was present at Geneva in June of that year when this agreement was put together, when the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council agreed on an outline for political transition in Syria. And those are the key words we have to keep in mind: political transition in Syria. The Russians who were present at Geneva did not want the name Bashar al-Assad mentioned. They didn't want the phrase regime change used. They even objected to a phrase about people with blood on their hands should not participate in the future governance of Syria, because they said, well, people will see that this refers to Bashar al-Assad. And we said, well, you're actually right about that. The problem about having a conference in the near term is that the subject matter, political transition, is not very likely to come about. The Assad regime on the ground is doing quite well militarily, not itself, but the Iranian-raised militias, foreign fighter militias from Lebanon and Iraq, are keeping this regime afloat. Russian arms supplies to the regime continue. So the question is, what, if anything, can be made out of this conference, which I suspect is going to take place? I think the opposition is going to swallow deep and say, yes, we'll be there. Well, I guess it's an opportunity for the opposition, such as it is, really to introduce itself to Syria and to the world. It's an opportunity for the Syrian opposition to come armed with a realistic list of people who should be in this transitional governing body. This is the thing that's supposed to lead the transition in Syria. Come with a list of people and present to the people of Syria the one thing that's been missing from the beginning of this, and that is the identity of the alternative to the Assad regime. There are a lot of Syrians who are still sticking with Bashar al-Assad because they have no earthly idea what the alternative is. And frankly, minorities, my closest friends who happen to be Syrian Christians, are very fearful. It's not that they have any illusion or love for Bashar al-Assad, but they're asking, what is the alternative? Okay, so there is an opportunity for the Syrian opposition to make something of this, but we shouldn't expect negotiated regime change to be the result.
But then when you say Syrian opposition, as if, the assumption is that there is unified Syrian opposition that is going to go to Geneva and face the representative of the Assad regime. Well, you know and I know that there are at least 30, 40, maybe 50 different groups that are fighting so-called rebels in Syria. Yes, there are 5 or 6 that, along with the Syrian Free Army, that may the moderate wing of the various rebels that fighting there. How are you going to get, for example, the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq representative to be there, and what will be their agenda? And how do you get the Jabhat al-Nusra there? And how do you get so many jihadi groups coming from all over the Middle East to come? So what sort of rebel representation are you going to have, let alone them to agree on a specific agenda? And I like to see that happen without any question. And just furthermore, you have outside players. You have Iran, you have Russia, like you mentioned, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Jordan, you have Turkey. Each of them have different agenda altogether. And finally, then you have this horrifying, we're just, I think, seeing the beginning of the Shia-Sunni war, and Syria has become the battleground. So if that's not enough, so I will leave it to you.
What's the bad news?
So
I'm
please.
ready to leave. You've put a lot on the table, and I think I would underscore what Fred said about the challenges, I think, are significant for these talks to go off. They may go off, but my sense is if they happen, they will be more or less a charade or a fig leaf exercise, precisely because of these various obstacles that are out there. The Syrian opposition is divided. In some ways, Fred, I guess I would say it's disappointing to me that here we are almost 3 years into this, and the Syrian opposition has failed to present an enticing, convincing alternative to what a post-Assad Syria would look like. So that work should have been done in advance of, well in advance of this kind of a conference. They remain fractured and divided, the political opposition as well as the rebels on the ground. The political opposition has the additional problem of being somewhat isolated and irrelevant from what's happening on the ground. But you raised maybe one of the most difficult obstacles, which is, what about all of these jihadi groups that have been attracted to Syria? And while they represent numerically still a minority, their influence is significant. Now, we're in the midst of some pretty horrific battles right now in Syria, in which I hesitate to call them moderate Islamist rebels, but Islamist rebels who don't share the same agenda as the jihadists.
Exactly, yeah.
Are battling to take back some control and some influence. But that said, when you said, well, how do we get the representatives of ISIS, the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq and Syria, to the table? These guys have no interest in negotiating. In fact, they've made it very clear that they view anyone that participates in these negotiations as being traitors. They're not interested in sitting at the table. They want to smash the table. And now I'm talking about the Al-Qaeda affiliated, the most extreme of those fighting on the ground. And frankly, they have an agenda that goes well beyond Syria, beyond post-Assad. They're looking to, in their minds, reestablish a transnational caliphate that would encompass Syria but would go beyond that.
That's right. I mean, basically, I think they are waging a holy war. And their agenda is, as we said before, and you agree, is completely different. I mean, from their perspective, they can see the emergence of the so-called extremist Sunni state comprised of Iraq and Syria, and they will continue to fight. And if Iraq itself, represent any kind of example of what's happening since the end of the war, since our American withdrawal from Iraq and the continuing battles day in and day out between the Sunni and the Shia today, I don't see how you can think in terms of this conflict in Syria is going to be settling anytime soon.
No,
but
it probably won't be settled anytime soon, and I certainly don't want to minimize or sweep under the rug the fragmentation of the Syrian opposition and all the problems it faces. Mona and I have both served in government, and sometimes in government you're faced with what we used to call in the Army a real soup sandwich that you've got to try to deal with. We have a situation here where, for better or for worse, I personally think for worse, the United States has insisted that this conference will take place, probably for no more of an elevated reason than nobody's got a better idea. The president demonstrated last August in response to the chemical atrocities that there are certain places he's not going to go in the context of Syria. So right now, Geneva is the only game in town. It's, to use a football metaphor, it's a bit of a Hail Mary pass. It's going to happen, all right? The opposition will have critical meetings, I think, on the 17th of this month. It will probably, we're talking about the national coalition, it will probably decide to attend. As I process all of this based on my experience in government, it really becomes a matter of trying to make the best of a hand that has no face cards and an assortment of 2s and 3s and 4s. And in that respect, given the fact that it really is a soup sandwich, that there is so much up for grabs in the Syrian opposition, this is an opportunity for the real nationalists, the people who don't have a sectarian agenda, to step into the international limelight at Geneva and perform credibly for the edification of Syrians and the rest of the world. It doesn't mean that this is a panacea. It doesn't mean that 20 minutes later you're going to have a solution in Syria. But this has got to start somewhere. And I think the essential problem they've had, something that's contributed to the problem, really has been the reluctance of the United States to press this opposition into governing inside Syria. And the reason we haven't pressed is because, frankly, it's someplace that President Obama doesn't want to go. Because if you're going to establish an alternate government, an alternate authority of some kind inside Syria, that authority is going to need recognition, it's going to need resources, and it's going to need help with self-defense. You can't just establish it as a target for Scud missiles and barrel bombs. Well, the United States hasn't wanted to go there. So basically, this coalition has been a collection of exiles. And we know what exile politics are like.
But then again, you see, you obviously seem to agree that the prospect for a political solution, at least coming anything from the Geneva II conference, is extremely dim, if it exists at all.
Right.
Then you have the situation in Syria itself. Syria, even before the war, still is a sectarian state. You have half a dozen different. You have the Shiite, you have the Sunni, you have the Alawite, you have the Kurds, you have the Christians, and and others. And this war has really torn the social fabric of Syria as we know it. Traditionally, there is a question of revenge, retribution, and after this whole disastrous disaster that evolved over the last 3 years, do you really think you can put Syria back together as a unit, as a single, united, as it was before? I think we might have passed that option if it exists any at this point.
You may well be right. I mean, I think many people, myself included, and I don't know if Fred would agree, believe that the Syria as we once knew it is essentially gone. And it's going to be something else that emerges from this process. And it is going to be a long and difficult process. Personally, I don't know that I see what has been discussed now a lot, the Balkanization of the Levant, where borders actually break down and new statelets and other things are created. Although it's very concerning to see, for example, the melding of arenas between Iraq and Syria, where you're seeing much more free flow of fighters and other things between Iraq's western Anbar province and the eastern parts of Syria. Likewise, because Lebanon and Syria have always had a very special kind of relationship, seeing as Lebanon was in fact carved out of greater Syria, there's a real melding of the arenas there. But I don't necessarily see the legal breakup of Syria into formal statelets, as some have suggested might happen. An Alawi stand along the Mediterranean coast, some kind of Sunni heartland state, a Druze statelet in the Jebel Druze in the southern part of Syria. I don't personally see that happening. But if we could go back just for a second to Geneva, because there is something I think can take place there that might be constructive and might begin to move the agenda forward. And that is to focus precisely on the sectarian dimensions of the conflict and on the growing proxy elements that are playing inside Syria. So that Syria, unfortunately now, is no longer just a conflict among Syrians. It is also, in many ways, a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and the Sunni Gulf states on the one hand, and Iran, Hezbollah, and Iraq on the other, and Turkey playing on the Sunni side. So one of the policies or measures that I've been advocating is to use the platform of Geneva to bring together key regional players, namely Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Iraq, with the U.S. and Russia, I believe, and the UN hosting, and to use some kind of platform to begin to talk about measures to de-escalate.
But don't you think this is really extraordinarily far-fetched? I mean, just think for a moment. What is Iran's ambition in the Middle East? I don't think that Iran will think for a moment to relinquish its ambition to become the region's hegemon. I don't think the Saudis will ever see eye to eye with Iran, being that the war between the two by proxy being waged both in Iraq and in Syria. So how do you see them sitting together actually agreeing on any kind of formula when in fact both are fighting to maintain their hegemony in the region? And from their perspective, for the Iranian, they say, well, the Shiite are majority in the Middle East, in the Gulf. If you to count them, the Shiite in Iraq and Iran itself, they are outnumbered. The Sunni by almost 2 to 1. So they feel that they have the right to become the hegemon there. And they're waging this war, and they will continue to wage it until they feel that they have secured what thing they've been dreaming of for so many decades, if not centuries. So Fred, how do you see any kind of reconciliation between, because the Sunni Shiite, in my view, conflict has already taken a course that is not going to be easily reversed at this juncture, no matter what happened in Geneva.
You know, at the risk of possibly injecting a note of optimism here, I believe very strongly, and I have no scientific basis by which I can present evidence for reasons that will be obvious. I feel very strongly that the vast majority of Syrian people want their country put back together, perhaps with a different kind of a system, perhaps with elements of empowered local governments. That would help. You know, right now you have a situation where the education minister in Damascus decides how many pencils go into a school kit in towns and cities elsewhere in Syria. I think most Syrians want to see a country where a sense of citizenship, a sense of being Syrian outweighs who you are in terms of sect, whether you're a Sunni, an Alawite, a Christian, and so forth. The difficulty right now is obvious. Those people, and let's say we're talking about 80% of the population, are essentially unrepresented when it comes to the people who are carrying rifles and machine guns. They are unrepresented. It's this miserable regime. It's Al-Qaeda. It's these extreme Islamists. These are the people who are all armed to the teeth. These are the people who are able to advance an agenda on the ground. Now, I think Mona's on to something with other possibilities at Geneva. The way this is supposed to work, on the 22nd, all these countries that have received invitations, the 30 countries, are supposed to meet in Montreux, where Ban Ki-moon is going to preside over the opening ceremony. Okay? Then, that's it for that group. 2 days later, in Geneva, the two Syrian parties are supposed to meet with Lakhdar Brahimi, the joint special representative, and they're supposed to start face-to-face interactions. Now, the United States, interestingly, is beginning to hint that, yeah, there won't be a formal role for all these other countries, but people are free to hang out around Geneva and talk. And I suspect one of the conversations will be an American-Iranian discussion about what it would take to have something that looks like a humanitarian truce in Syria. In other words, what, if anything, are the Iranians willing to do to pressure their client to stop the barrel bombs, the artillery, the helicopters, the jet fighters, the Scud missiles, and the rockets that are being deliberately vectored into densely populated areas in the hope that maybe a rebel or two will be killed.
But they would do so as long as that serves their interest. Now, will they do so if Bashar Assad, is out of the equation?
No, I think they want. No, I don't expect the Iranians to be at all helpful at this stage on the issue of political transition. They need Bashar al-Assad. They need him. They need him because of the services Assad and the regime provide to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which, as long as there's an Israeli threat of an attack on Iran, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon with their missiles and rockets, this is Iran's first line of defense. This is Iran's strategic deterrent against Israel. From an Iranian perspective, nobody is better than Bashar al-Assad when it comes to supporting Hezbollah. So until that Israeli threat goes away, I don't think the Iranians are going to be the least bit interested in political transition. But the humanitarian thing may be different because by many accounts, they were really upset by the regime's use of chemical weapons. And unlike the Russians, they haven't tried to deny it, and they haven't tried to assign responsibility to Syrian rebels for that atrocity.
But then again, if you say the Iranians need Bashar Assad, so does that mean that Bashar Assad ought to become or should be part of the solution? And if he's part of the solution, will the rebel accept that? Will the United States accept that? I mean, this is what then, Mona, if I might turn to you just for another question, that is, let's say Assad is in or out, but that is not going to be the end of the story. Assad inherited not just the presidency, he inherited entire apparatus of the military, internal security, internal intelligence, and every single one of those at the top hierarchy in all of these branches of the government, they have a blood on their hands. How are you going to reconcile that under any circumstances to find a political solution whereby the various troubles, they're going to be able to see eye to eye, and hopefully Syria will remain a single unit? Do you see that at all possible?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between Bashar al-Assad and those immediately around him, the Makhloufs and his brother Maher, and kind of this thuggish clan that forms the heart of the regime, and the broader Alawite community, as well as the broader military and security apparatus. Because my sense is that the answer for Syria is not the equivalent of de-Baathification in Iraq, which is to say a complete wipeout of that security military apparatus. Because I think we hopefully learned a lesson from Iraq about the chaos that then ensued as a result. So in my best world of worlds, and I would actually differ a little bit with Fred about the utility of Bashar al-Assad to the Iranians. I think their position might be a little more malleable, might be a little more nuanced, and may evolve depending on what happens with the nuclear discussions. That might unlock some important possibilities for broader regional stability and a rethinking of the regional security architecture. But for me, I mean, Syria is an extraordinarily difficult challenge. And there's no perfect answer to this. But for me, what would make the most sense is some kind of political transition pushed by all parties, Russia and Iran included, whereby Bashar al-Assad and this thuggish core transitions out. And we can talk about how that happens. But that the broader frame of the state remains.
This is true, but who's going to be able to do just that? Get rid of this 2,000-3,000 who've been conducting all this vicious massacres.
Everybody has blood on their hands in Syria. I don't think you can say 2,000 or 3,000. Everybody has blood on their hands, including on the opposition side.
But then you know the culture. You know what's happening. What happens in Iraq, it's going to happen in Syria. Yeah. Those who lost relatives, daughters, sons, fathers, brothers, sisters, are they really going to say, well, there is a truth and reconciliation like what happened? What is it going to take? It's going to take more than a conference. I think that many other elements are missing. Look at South Africa, for example, the suffering of the black has suffered. What happened there? Can you duplicate that? What is missing?
Wish.
Well, we can't.
I wish
It
we
won't
had
happen.
Mandela. I wish we had a kind of truth and reconciliation model. In the Arab context, we really don't. But you have to work with what you have to work with. What's the alternative? The alternative is this goes on. You began our discussion by reciting this such sad litany of where Syria is today, in terms of the numbers of people killed, in terms of the numbers of children that are suffering, the destruction of infrastructure. If the fighting goes on for too much longer, there's not going to be a Syria left.
But then again, Fred, if I may, then again, what you have here Bashar al-Assad forces have been gaining grounds in the last few months. Under what circumstances will Bashar al-Assad make any kind of serious concession to accommodate the rebels when in fact he believes that he may eventually win this conflict? And why would the rebel negotiate from a position of weakness? And so what you have to do, in my view, if you really want to have any prospect for ending this conflict in a somewhat peaceful manner, if that is possible at all, you're going to have to change the power equation on the ground first. And so then one of the reasons I don't think that's the political solution, albeit is the only solution in the final analysis, but you have to create the environment for a political solution on the ground. And this environment today doesn't exist. And what's your take on that?
This was John Kerry's theme when he first became Secretary of State and he was focusing on Syria. He essentially told President Obama, look, Mr. President, there's not a thing wrong with a negotiated, peaceful solution in accordance with the Geneva Agreement. The problem is we have to change Bashar al-Assad's calculation. Exactly. All right? And the objective problem over the last several months is that calculation has changed, but it's changed in the wrong direction.
Opposite direction, yes.
It's changed in the opposite direction, so that, I think we can stipulate that the upcoming conference at Geneva, even if it lasts several weeks or a month and a half or whatever, is not going to produce political transition in Syria. What Mona described very accurately is in fact the Geneva formula, and the Russians knew what they were signing up to at the time. It was forming this transitional governing body on the basis of mutual consent, meaning mutual veto, which means that people like Bashar al-Assad would not make the roster, okay? And at the same time, trying as best as you can to avoid the Iraqi catastrophe by preserving, such as they are, institutions of state, ministries, and, the Syrian army. Look, most of the Syrian army is on the sidelines now. It can be used in stability operations if this, political transition scheme is ever achieved. But this is precisely the Geneva formula that was negotiated. The problem right now, as you indicate, you would have to repeal some basic laws of politics, of political physics, for this to work, because Bashar al-Assad, thanks to the Iranians, thanks to the Russians, and frankly, thanks to things that we have really failed to do on our side, Bashar al-Assad thinks he's winning.
Yeah.
So what are the chances he's going to send a delegation to Geneva with instructions that they should negotiate him out of power?
So what is going to be then, Mona? What's going to be the rules of engagement? Here they have come all together. Where do you start? The opposition is sitting on one side. Bashar al-Assad representative are there. The rebels are sitting there. Where are you to begin? Any negotiation requires some rules of engagement. Where do you start? What is going to be the starting point? What do you discuss?
Well, again, my sense is that you are not, because of exactly this imbalance, you are not going to come away with the kind of political transition that one has envisioned, that is envisioned by the Geneva Communique under the current set of circumstances. So I personally do not think it makes sense at this time to bring the Syrians around the table, because the opposition is at such a disadvantage. And the one potential downside with this idea that it goes off because they're going to be dragooned to the table is that those moderates who actually really do form the future of a Syria that we would all hope will eventually emerge from all this may be very badly discredited by taking part
That's
in
a real
something.
danger. It's a real danger.
Right.
And a lot depends on how we act. Look, the Russians are going to come to Geneva saying nice words publicly, but they are going to be like this with the Assad regime.
Exactly.
There are going to be ongoing consultations. There are going to be strategy sessions between the Russians and the regime. What I fear, and what I think may be the case, unless things get turned around quickly, is the United States is going to come to this negotiation with a sort of even-handed, let's all just sit down and talk this through. Let's have a dialogue, and this is going to increase the opposition's sense of isolation, because we're going to be leaning on them to be reasonable while the Russians are going for broke.
Exactly.
With the regime. And this is a real problem. There was an NGO in Washington that did a simulation that I believe Mona took part in.
Yeah.
And this was the essential problem. The Russians came in with a sense of purpose. This is a negotiation. We're going to try to win. The United States came in with this, can't we all just reason together here?
But then again, exactly.
Well, the opposition was badly divided, and that was another problem.
And the lack of American support.
But then,
and eclipsed by the armed groups on the ground.
Yeah, the Russian, however, have always taken assumed the agenda. I mean, they have pretty much determined what is the course of action is going to take vis-a-vis, be that on the chemical weapon, be that on the agreeing on this particular Geneva 1 and Geneva 2, and so they've been leading the show thus far. But I want to raise another question. In any negotiation, again, I want to go to some of these principles. Yeah. You need a commitment by the parties who are negotiating to agree. We want to reach an agreement. Do you see either side making that commitment? I mean, they come to Geneva saying, we are looking to work together to resolve this conflict, and we are committed to a solution. And then if you don't have that commitment, how is Geneva is going to produce one?
No, that's, as I said, I don't believe that the parties in particular have, on the part of the regime, have an interest in making that commitment. On the part of the opposition, have the capacity to enforce a commitment. They don't have sway on those groups fighting on the ground. That's why, from my perspective, analytically, while I understand the value and the need to have the process and to think about political transition in Syria, I've been advocating for what I call Geneva 1.5, which is to say, look, what you just described, rules of engagement, an agreement, we're going to get to a kind of a willingness and an agreement that we're going to seek some kind of compromise. The conditions simply aren't there right now for that to happen. What I would argue is I actually maybe differ with both of you on Russia and Iran in terms of, is there a shift in their views of how this conflict is evolving, and in particular the jihadist threat that has been on the increase. Syria now surpasses Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of the numbers of foreign fighters that have been attracted to Syria. That constitutes a real threat for Russia and for Iran. So I'm sort of arguing, can we bring together, keep both international and regional powers to begin to get at some of the issues in which there may be a shared interest. Fred talked about negotiating humanitarian access. What about the idea, again, of trying to de-escalate the sectarian rhetoric? I think that is actually considered, in my opinion, you might differ with me, I actually think the sectarian dynamic is evolving in such a dangerous fashion. And we are literally, in the last 2 weeks, we have seen the makings of the much feared regional conflagration between events in Iraq and Lebanon, not to mention what goes on every day in Syria. So are we at a point where this conflict, as a conflict, represents such a threat to regional stability that key actors are willing to to reconsider their own strategic calculus.
But then, as long as you think, if you assume that the regional players, be that Iran, Saudi Arabia, some other Gulf states, Turkey, necessarily have an interest in ending the conflict at this particular juncture, when the outcome may not be to their advantage. And so civil wars could last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. What's the rush as far as they're concerned? They can wait. As far as Iran goes, well, Iran is not going to make concession or use its influence with the Assad regime or elsewhere, only, as I said earlier, to the extent it can maintain its influence throughout the crescent from the Mediterranean to the Gulf. And they are not about to relinquish that interest by simply accommodating the Syrian or the American or the Russian without.
You know, Alon, for the last year and a half, we've been having with the Russians a cause and effect, chicken and egg debate about this question of foreign fighters and Islamist extremists. And the debate is a very simple one. Our position, which I believe to be factually and literally true, is that Bashar al-Assad and his regime is the cause of that presence inside Syria. This regime, the way it has behaved, the way it has processed all of this, the way it has pursued relentlessly a shameless sectarian strategy, has become a magnet for foreign fighters and jihadists of all descriptions, to say nothing of the lingering official contacts between that regime and al-Qaeda in Iraq. After all, it was the Assad regime that spent the better part of 10 years escorting these characters to Iraq so that they could kill Shia and Americans. Okay? This is essentially the problem, because the Russian position is Bashar al-Assad is part of the answer here.
Well, then
He's a secularist. So yeah, we have objectively, we have a shared interest. Neither we nor the Russians want eastern Syria to become a training ground for Chechens and, you know, God knows what else. But there is a fundamental difference that still has not been resolved as to what is the cause of this and what's the answer.
and how are you going to get rid of them?
Pardon me?
How are you going to get rid of them?
Oh, look.
What means?
Look, Mona's
methods?
right. We're talking about a decades-long process for the reconstruction of Syria on many, many, many different levels. You know, the question is where to begin. Geneva, for all the reasons we've discussed, is a very imperfect vehicle to get this started. But I'm telling you, something's going to happen in Montreux on the 22nd, and in Geneva starting on the 24th. If the Syrian National Coalition is able to put together a delegation, I'm quite convinced that that delegation will come to Geneva prepared to work for a settlement in accordance with Geneva I. It's manifestly in their interest to do it. And this is the one thing that makes the regime very nervous about Geneva. They don't like the subject matter. The subject matter is political transition. Okay? I think that there can be parallel discussions on humanitarian affairs, on sectarianism and all of that, but the United States and the opposition absolutely must keep the primary discussion very rigidly on political transition. This is the subject matter of Geneva. As bad as the timing of this whole thing is, given the situation on the ground, if you lose sight of what this negotiation is supposed to be about, then you've lost everything. Then the opposition people you've dragooned become absolutely, totally discredited. They have to stay on subject and let the regime squirm.
But then you said let the regime squirm, but then who is going to put the real pressure on Bashar al-Assad? Where is this pressure going to come? So he's going to go, he's concerned about the position that you have just described taken by the rebels. But who's going to really put the kind of pressure on him to actually, he can maintain his position? Do you really expect Russia and Iran, for humanitarian reason, for any other reason, to put the kind of pressure on Bashar al-Assad to accept a solution that's not to his liking at this juncture? What do you think, Mona?
Yeah, I think it comes down to nothing is going to be solved on the 22nd of January or even in the weeks following. So let's just be clear about that. My sense is that what we would hope and what one is looking for is precisely for Russia and Iran to put pressure on Assad in the way that we would also need to pressure those that are, the Saudis and others that might be fueling the conflict. I mean, let's be fair. This conflict is a two-sided conflict or a multi-sided conflict. It's being fueled on all sides. And so again, I go back to what I've said before. I think at this point, it is of such magnitude. It is so dangerous in terms of for regional stability. And of course, the humanitarian nightmare that Syria has become demands that the world respond. And so on those key points, I do think there can be a consensus made. That's what diplomacy is about. It's extraordinarily difficult, but that's what's going to happen.
But then, again, I'd like to be always the double advocate here. Look around you. Look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's been going on now for 60-odd years. Look what's happening in Afghanistan for the last 12 years. Look what's happening in Iraq. Is there any reason for us to believe that this particular conflict now in Syria is going to be resolved when the complexity, as a matter of fact, what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq probably is considerably less complex than what's happening in Syria? You have this what we are seeing is and I think I'd like to suggest that it's in the context of what we call the so-called Arab Spring. I don't think you can take these revolution and evolutionary process taking place, however bloody, as a part of an overall larger revolution that has come to the Middle East. And I don't see how you're going to end, be that the conflict within Egypt itself, or be that in Syria, or in Libya, or elsewhere, by simply appealing to the humanitarian aspect of these, and that's not going to happen. And I think the dynamics need to change, and I'm looking for ways. How can we change the dynamics to bring about, like say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? We were discussing with Fred just earlier. I think the American approach is quite naive. I don't think that's going to lead to any breakthrough among these two, when in fact the parameters are clear. And so here we're saying it's in the best interest of the Syrian people to find a solution. But it's not going to happen. Why is it not going to happen? At least I'd assume that it's not going to happen. Not yet.
I share your pessimism, but I think we don't have the luxury of turning our backs on the problem. We don't have the luxury, I think, of disavowing diplomacy. That's my feeling.
But then diplomacy has to be backed by other elements, perhaps by force. Fred, what do you think? I mean, is diplomacy in and of itself today is going to produce a solution, be that now or Europe from now or 2 years down the line, or is it going to have other elements introduced into this conflict?
Diplomacy is not just a matter of people sitting around speaking to one another elegantly and indirectly and circling around the buffet table, trying to get at the shrimp. Diplomacy has a hard aspect to it too. And look, I know there's a tremendous amount of controversy over whether the United States should have done military strikes in the wake of the chemical atrocity last August. I realize that a relatively small minority of Americans actually favored that, okay? But I think just as a matter of political science, okay, objectively, we can say that when the credible threat of American military strikes in Syria went away in exchange for this chemical weapons agreement, Bashar al-Assad, much to the distress of President Obama and everybody else, Bashar al-Assad interpreted this as a permission slip to do anything he wanted to do to civilian populations as long as he wasn't doing it without chemicals. All right? And this is the dilemma we face today as we try to configure what we hope will be a civilized negotiating process. When we negotiated the original Geneva final communique, Kofi Annan, who was the special representative then, insisted that his 6-point plan, which was basically a plan for de-escalation in Syria, be inserted into the memorandum. He recognized you really can't do this. You really can't sit around over coffee and tea and have a civilized discussion when civilian populations are under relentless assault. And this is why, as far as I'm concerned, as a practical matter, quite aside from the matter of saving lives, some kind of a humanitarian truce that would involve unfettered access for United Nations humanitarian workers and organizations. You know, unfortunately, one of the consequences of not having supported and recognized an alternate government in Syria is that as far as the United Nations and the United States is concerned, Bashar al-Assad is still the president of Syria. And for the United Nations to operate inside Syria, it needs his permission. It needs his permission to go into neighborhoods that are under siege and being starved out. It needs his permission to go into parts of Aleppo and Idlib that are routinely being pounded every day, apartment blocks being leveled, people being killed, people running for their lives. It needs his permission. This is where the Iranians and the Russians come in. Look, I think they both want him to survive politically. Okay, but does his political survival really depend on an unending series of war crimes and crimes against humanity? Is that what it takes? Is this what the Russians and the Iranians are willing to stand up for and defend?
But he's done it, he's getting away with it, and now he's asked to send a representative to Geneva, to another conference. But just one other point, if you may comment on it. Diplomacy, I am without any doubt in support of any kind of conflict by diplomatic means. This is a given as far as I'm concerned. But diplomacy does not work in a situation like this, when either party or both parties do not suffer the consequences of the failure. What will be the consequences of a failure of this diplomatic effort in Geneva for Bashar al-Assad? What will be the consequence of the failure for the rebels themselves? I mean, this is, if they cannot see a danger far greater than the danger they are in it now, what is going to motivate them to make the kind of concession necessary unless they feel they can further improve their position first.
Well, I think the consequences of a failure would be far worse for the opposition. I mean, there's no question about it. And those who will suffer the most are Syrian civilians who are effectively caught in the middle, caught between both sides.
But do they really care at this point?
They may not.
Well, that's
They
the whole
may
thing.
not. They may not. And I do subscribe to Fred's point. I think it's absolutely true. You have to have the credible threat of the use of force backing any diplomatic endeavor. The question is, what does that credible threat look like? What does that use of force look like? Is it funneling more arms to the rebels? I don't know. Personally, I don't believe that is the way to go. Is it some kind of constructing some kind of NATO response or force, or we have Patriot missiles that are staged in southern Turkey and in Jordan, I believe. These questions are far more difficult, I think. It's easy. I wish I could say, yes, funnel more arms into the rebels. Let's build them up on the ground. That's going to help solve this problem. I wish I could say it. I wish I believed it. I don't. I think that, unfortunately, that's merely going to continue to escalate this conflict.
Well, I share your wish, but I don't. I remain just as a skeptic.
Yeah, my reservation there is if you deny arms, equipment, training to those you wish to support, because you think that by doing so constitutes an escalation, you're enabling their military defeat. Now, what was considered last August, albeit very briefly, in response to this chemical atrocity, was a series of airstrikes that would have been targeted directly at the tools of terror that the regime was using. Its artillery, its aircraft, its Scud missiles, its rockets. That was basically the military mission that was under consideration. It wasn't, parachuting the 82nd Airborne into Damascus. It wasn't
course, yeah.
boots on the ground. It wasn't even regime change. It was a targeted, punitive campaign that would have lasted several days.
I agree with you 100%. I think that was a tragic mistake, and the Syrian people continue to suffer as a result, at least in part because of the inaction on our part. So we're going to turn to you now and take some questions. Please limit yourself to a question. So I'd like to entertain as many questions as possible with the limited time that we have left. Just raise your hand and the microphone is available for you too. Yes, please, right here in the front row seat here.
Hi. My question is, given the state that the conflict is right now and there's no clear military defeat either on both sides of the conflict, what are the prospects of achieving a settlement that is acceptable to both parties, that doesn't really imply working with Bashar al-Assad to progress after this conflict? What is the prospect that this realistically happens? How can you eliminate him completely and still create a settlement that is acceptable to the regime itself when you've actually said that they actually think they're winning the war? And I guess building on this, because atrocities have been committed on both sides, in the long run, how much worse would it be to empower a rebel faction that's we've talked about? There's extremists, there's jihadists, there's they're really fractioned and fragmented, than having a weakened version of that regime result of this settlement.
My sense is, again, I think we are in what can only be described as a protracted military stalemate, that whereas Bashar al-Assad may think he's winning, the fact of the matter is he will never, in my opinion, regain control over the whole of Syria. He's lost control over significant parts of the country. He is relying very significantly on foreign forces to do his bidding. Likewise, I don't believe that the rebels will in any way, shape, or form coalesce significantly and take over the entire country. So, I mean, that's the problem that we're in right now. The issue, I guess, that I can see, and maybe it goes back to what we were talking about before, is we're not, I guess, at what's called a herding stalemate, where both sides see that there really is no better option than to sit down and talk. It's clear that Assad doesn't see it that way. I don't think the rebels, many of those groups, see it that way either.
Yes, you're right. I think there's sometimes the exhaustion. Both sides to get to a point where they're totally exhausted, and they're now forced to come to a solution. Yes, we'll take a question back there on top, please.
Thank you. Based on all what you've said, it sounds to me that the attempt to find a political solution is so outdated and unrealistic based on everything I've heard. And if one wants to reset back, what are the real issues that might unite and focuses everybody's minds on a solution? Wouldn't that be one, containing or putting an end to the human tragedy there, and two, containing or putting an end to the emerging Al-Qaeda threat in that region? Those would be real unifying factors, and those ought to be the framework rather than trying to set the clock back or trying to find a political solution.
Yeah, I think I think this has been the theme we've discussed tonight is the difficulty under current conditions of trying to find a political solution that would take hold in a reasonable period of time. I think we basically agree that Geneva itself is not likely to be a venue for miracles here. My personal view is that rather than going for Geneva, but it's going to happen, so let's accept that, the real emphasis of American diplomacy should have been and should be now on mitigating this humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place. If you want to enable worthwhile political discussions, you're going to have to do that anyway, all right? So why not concentrate on what really matters here, all right? The Syrian people are going through hell. The neighbors, which include American allies and friends, are suffering the spillover consequences, both in humanitarian and political and security terms, right? A task for American diplomacy here, and it's not easily achievable, I'll grant that, is to work with the Iranians and Russians and try to persuade them that it's not necessary for their client to engage in worst practices here. And the other thing I'd like to caution about is let's not go down the blind path of moral equivalency here. All right, this is not just a matter of a population being caught between two sides. If you read the reports of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, reports that this commission gives to the Human Rights Council, it is very clear where the overwhelming impact of this humanitarian abomination is coming from. And it is the daily practice of the regime to use artillery, aircraft, rockets, and missiles on built-up, populated areas. Do elements of the so-called opposition do atrocities? Sure they do. If we're talking about nearly half of the Syrian population requiring humanitarian assistance of one kind or another, the preeminent, overwhelming cause of that is the tactics and strategy of the Assad regime. And you don't have to take it from me. You can read the reports of this commission and the conclusion of the UN Human Rights Council.
Okay, This gentleman, please.
Good evening, and thank you for the presentation. I come from Israel, and I wanted to ask a more narrow question on what your views are of the Israeli response throughout these 2 years, and maybe even more specifically on how this whole crisis might affect the future of the status of the Golan Heights.
That's your thing. That's for you
What
to
the
answer.
Israelis are doing.
You've done some good.
Well, you know, in Israel, and I should probably just pass the baton to Alon. In Israel, as you well know, there are, well, you know, every Israeli probably has about 11 different opinions about what's happening in
That's being
Syria
conservative.
and what should be done. I think as a practical matter, the Israelis, unlike the United States, has issued a red line warning and has done something about it. Anytime the government of Israel perceives, correctly or incorrectly, but let's say correctly, perceives that there is a prospect of a weapons transfer from the Assad regime to Hezbollah, Israel will take steps, usually helping itself to Lebanese airspace, to do something about that, to hit and hit hard. Okay? I think, you know, in Israel there's a mixture of opinions. Some people say, well, you know, Bashar al-Assad is the devil we know. Others say, no, this guy's a total disaster. This guy is he's just a Trojan horse for the Iranians and for Hezbollah. So there is a difference of opinion, but as a practical matter, I think Israel has basically restricted itself to this narrow issue of potential weapons transfers, in some cases right out of the Syrian army inventory. This is why Bashar al-Assad is so handy for the Iranians. Because, and the Iranians have come to the conclusion that any potential replacement for this guy can't possibly be as good as the real thing, because he'll take things right out of the inventory and hand it over to Hezbollah.
But I think also he made it a point not to provoke Israel, almost under any circumstances. Provoking Israel could bring his demise much sooner than much later. So this is one thing that he made sure that Israel is not to be provoked, fearing massive Israeli retaliation. And this is my understanding from several Israeli officials. So we'll take another question. Anyone else? Are you suggesting we solve all the Syrian problem? No more questions? One more question. We have two more questions, three, and we're going to conclude with that. Yes.
Okay. For this question, I'm gonna assume I'm not that aware or ignore all those geopolitical international power struggles or stake struggles that are taking place in the Syria and issue. I'm gonna ask. I really see a victimization of the civil population, and I'm really aware that the civil population is suffering a lot and something has to be done around it. But I see all the shrinking of all of the possibilities and options given to this population into humanitarian aid. As far as I'm concerned, democracy is about what the people thinks about this. And if the people of Syria itself are not being involved in this solution, I don't see any long-term change that might take place. I see that the international community is just being two options, which is either there is an opposition to the government that is strengthened enough for it to take power, or just there is a truce between the government and the opposition, and this government, which is led by Bashar al-Assad, lives peacefully. But I don't see in the international community any solutions that are pointing out that population and how can they take place in this transition. I come from a country, Colombia, that has suffered civil war, and in which we really are aware of the consequences of living the conflicts just in head of two powers that are using arms to solve the conflict. If the population of Colombia, as it's doing right now, has taken use of that democracy option it has, of knowing how they can involve themselves to solve the conflict, things might have been different. What is the role the international community want to give the civil population of Syria that is not part of either Bashar al-Assad or the opposition country, but that is the majority, and I feel the core of the solution to this conflict?
It's a great question, and it's really important that you raised it, because I think often that's exactly who gets forgotten in all of this, are the sort of Syrian civil society, Syrian peaceful protesters and activists. In many ways, I think the initial impetus for the uprising has been lost and forgotten in what has now evolved into a very bloody and sectarian civil war. The humanitarian issues, I think, still have this tremendous urgency. You have people literally starving to death in Syria. We're in the midst of winter and so forth. So I actually think that the humanitarian issues, and I would agree with Fred and have advocated this myself, in many ways, they need to be front and center right now. But that doesn't preclude other measures to ensure that Syrian civil society, Syrian activists are integrated into discussions, whether it's at Geneva, as well as in the kinds of assistance programs that are ongoing. There's lots of work that's being done, admittedly, I think, at a distance because of how dangerous it is right now to work inside Syria. But there are projects being undertaken to try and build nascent bodies of local governance, to try and build on the efforts that the Syrians themselves have launched. And they're incredibly brave and have done quite a bit. My sense is what we really need to be thinking about is how, in trying to stabilize Syria, whether it's through humanitarian assistance, relief, and other aids, how can you shape that kind of assistance in such a way that it will actually take on board and begin the transition that so many Syrians aspire to?
Fred, last word?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment on this. Just before coming over here, I got a hold of the official invitation from the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to the parties to attend Geneva. I'd just like to read a couple of sentences from his last paragraph here, because I think it illustrates part of the problem here of the international community getting its head around the real fact of human beings being slaughtered and scattered and incapacitated. Here it is. This is from Ban Ki-moon. The government, meaning the Syrian government, and all parties must allow immediate and full humanitarian access to all conflict-affected areas. The violence must be ended expeditiously. All attacks against civilians should cease. All parties must work to put an end to all terrorist acts. I think what I'd ask the Secretary General of the United Nations is, why is it attacks against civilians are somewhat more permissible than these other things that absolutely must stop?
Well, I hate to end this on this note, but time has come to end this, and I want to express my most deepest gratitude to Mona for your wonderful contribution to this discussion. And my dear friend Fred, thank you so much for taking the time as well.
Thank you all.
And thank you all of you for being here. Thank you very much.